I managed to break into the circle. And the editor at the time, John Witherow, looked at me rather suspiciously and said to Diana, "Here's Philip Beresford. He compiles our annual Sunday Times Rich List." To which she said, "Oh, that's very interesting. I read that." And I said, "Yes. And shouldn't you be in it?" To which he replied, "Wouldn't you like to know?" To which I replied, champagne talking, "Yes, I really would. How much are you worth?" And I looked up and there was a stunned silence.
Let's start with 1989. Why was the Rich List created?
It actually owes its origin to a list in America developed by Forbes magazine, the business magazine, the now famous Forbes 400, and that inspired the Sunday Times Rich List. And I had dabbled in the area previously and was asked to do it by Andrew Neil, then the editor of the Sunday Times. And it was just the top 200 then, and it went on and became 1,000 within about 4 or 5 years. And I kept doing it for 28 years.
Wow, and that's a very long time to kind of see things change. But in those very early stages, how did people react to it? Were the people included in the list happy? Were people interested in seeing who the richest people in Britain were?
It was a combination. I heard anecdotal stories of people who were in the list phoning their friends who were also in the list saying, "Hello, it's number 24 here. Am I speaking to number 62? And they seemed to like it. The old money, the dukes and the viscounts and the lords hated it. One duke who I tried to speak to on the phone, when his butler got him, said to me, his exact words were, "This is appalling, utterly appalling. I will have to have a word with the powers that be." He hated it. He thought I was a communist agitator. And that was typical of how the old money regarded it.
In the first year the Queen was number one, was there kind of pushback from the royal family at all?
Not really. I mean, we put the Queen as number one because we weren't very refined in those days. Later on, it became much more apparent that we should try to separate her wealth as an individual with the wealth that was in her name, but was in fact nothing she could really do with, such as Buckingham Palace or her art collection. And that's how we carried on. I mean, it's an enormous grey area. I mean, the royals and rich activity is something that bugged me for a long time. And several years later, at the Sunday Times Christmas party in 1996, the star guest was Diana, Princess of Wales, who obviously, tragically died several months later. But she was there, surrounded by the editor and all the executives on the paper, all very pleased with themselves. Sadly, I had several glasses of very, very fine champagne that the Sunday Times was actually serving. And I thought, I've got to get here and find out a little bit more about her wealth. So I managed to break into the circle. And the editor at the time, John Witherow, looked at me rather suspiciously and said to Diana, "Here's Philip Beresford. He compiles our annual Sunday Times Rich List." To which she said, "Oh, that's very interesting. I read that." And I said, "Yes. And shouldn't you be in it?" To which he replied, "Wouldn't you like to know?" To which I replied, champagne talking, "Yes, I really would. How much are you worth?" And I looked up, and there was a stunned silence. And I looked at John Witherer, I looked at all the executives. The next second, the tight circle excluded me. And I thought to myself, as I went to console myself with more champagne, I thought, I have lost my job now. Couple of weeks, nothing happened. A couple of weeks later, I bumped into the editor. He said, that was an interesting conversation you had with Diana. I thought, this is it. And I said, yes, but you employ me to ask those questions. And he said, yes, you're right. And that was the end of the matter. And I was terrified that at the time it would get into the gossip columns, but it didn't, thank goodness.
That's fantastic. Did you ever find out how much she was worth?
I did an estimate. I think it was a bit of an underestimate. Actually, on her own, she would not have made the rich list, but I was in that questioning mode.
and we're glad for it. And when you kind of took on the task, obviously inspired by the Forbes version, but how did you go about compiling? How do you work out each year who's worth what and how much?
Well, in the early days, it was really tough because the internet didn't exist. And I mean, we hear about social media, etc., but the real purpose of the rich list, of finding information about people for the rich list, requires searching electronic databases in reality, and those weren't available in 1989. But they gradually were starting to become available. So it was, dare I say it, very hit and miss in the early days. People were missing. People were over I'd gone too far or too low. But gradually, as those databases became available, I was able to search company accounts very easily and efficiently at home where I worked. I always worked in my office at home. I was an early pioneer of working from home. And it became easier, and I was able to find lots of new people. Google searches, electronic libraries, the lot, they all helped. And I started to fill in the gaps. When people saw me doing that, who should be in the rich list, they, saw that I was trying to do a serious job, and it wasn't just muckraking, although if you believe the Dukes, it was. So they cooperated more, and it was astonishing how the cooperation went. One guy sent me his tax return to prove his wealth. I would get letters from their accountants, respectable accountants, detailing all their assets other than the company assets that I could see. And it really helped, and success built on success. We were perceived as a serious operation and not just a gossip column writ large.
That's fascinating. And I think that's a good point to then turn to 2003. So that's 20 years ago now. And you had been doing the Rich List for 15 years by that point. When you were going into kind of the later stages, how much had things changed with that element of, had it become something people really wanted to be included in?
Yes, it did. But I did develop a golden rule that the more people pressed to be in, the more suspicious I would become and demand more proof. And if they couldn't provide the proof, i.e. a respectable accountant's letter, detailing their assets, confirming, signed off by a senior partner at the accountancy firm, then I would say that's not enough. And on the other side, the people who didn't want to be in the list, who I could prove, I would very cautiously put them in if I could prove the business assets and wait for the reaction, because there was nothing that was ever salacious gossip about them, nothing that was in any way that they could disagree with in the entry I wrote. They usually came round to a grudging acceptance. And grudging acceptance would sometimes lead to, okay, we're going to be in, we'll help him properly.
There's kind of a big shift in those first 15 years. Obviously, the Queen was number one in 1989, and a number of dukes and other members of the aristocracy. At what point and why did you decide to separate how you measured the wealth and take away the kind of the value of the crown?
This was about 2 or 3 years later than when we started, by which stage anyway, this was a time when the London property market was really on fire. And the big estates owned by the Duke of Westminster, Earl Cadogan, who owns Chelsea, Viscount Portman, who owns the Portman estate, they were increasing in value enormously. And you could actually see the value going up in their properly audited accounts. So they were naturals to go in higher and higher and higher.
In 2003, we start to see more foreign nationals come in. Was that something that people reacted to? Were they surprised?
Well, it was a reflection of the fact in those days, of course, Russia wasn't the, quote, enemy that it is now. And Russian oligarchs who had made a fortune out of the privatization of Russian assets in the early 90s were suddenly had such huge fortunes that they would come to live in London because they were terrified that things might go wrong in Moscow and they could be imprisoned or their fortunes could be seized again. So they would park as much as they could in London, live in London. They loved London because it was it had the rule of law which protected their assets. Property law was very much on their side. They could get their kids educated at the top private schools. London was easy to get to from anywhere in the world, and it had a fantastic financial system that basically was there for them to exploit. And obviously there have been suggestions of how the city colluded, or many parts of the city colluded in money laundering. But it was a time of enormous opportunity for London on the back of all of that wealth coming in. And of course, it affected us all with rising house prices, etc., etc.
And finally, then on 2003, before we move forward again in history, it's at this point the Sunday Times Richest had certainly become something prestigious and very esteemed. What was it like to see it become something people began to wait for? For
me, personally, it was an enormous relief. Enormous relief. I mean, in the early days, particularly, once I knew it was coming out, I was in absolute terror of receiving legal threats, huge complaints, press council complaints, etc. They never happened, but I was so nervous. And then gradually, as it became accepted and seen as a serious work rather than the gossip column, I was able to relax slightly, but not too much. Because if I ever relaxed, then I'd make a mistake.
Let's head to 2013 then. things have changed a lot again, but as the UK entered the 2010s, a lot's changed economically post 2008. How different had things become at this stage?
Well, looking at the rich list, the graphs in the rich list in the 2000s, I was always struck every year how we actually followed the economic fortunes of Britain. So in the time of the dot-com crash in 2001, I think we went down a bit in wealth, and then it started to pick up and roared ahead. Then 2008, 9, 10, it didn't rise as fast as it had done, but it still, I think from memory, rose because of the influx of foreigners who were not affected by the British economy problems at the time.
I see. And how did that shape the rich list? Did that mean that foreign internationals were kind of leading the way?
Look at the 2013 list 10 years ago. You know, the first 3, 4, 5, 6 are foreign nationals living here. And it just goes on. The first real English person who's born and bred here, number 8, the Duke of Westminster. You know, that was symbolic of the way that foreign money had come in and was able to prosper despite the travails of the British economy.
That's really interesting. And I suppose throughout the rich list, as you would maybe expect, a lot of these people live in London. Is that a theme that you notice throughout your time compiling the list, or is the wealth spread across the country?
It's always been concentrated in London. And you could say it's been concentrated in London for 1,000 years. Sometime at the turn of the millennium, we did a list of the richest Britons of all time, and from the time of William the Conqueror. And it's always struck me doing it, and we had a formula for working out what their wealth would be today, just how concentrated wealth was in London. And it's carried on. At least half of the millionaires in the rich list and billionaires are based in London or the southeast. Because, I mean, London has always been a city of finance, you know, high risk, duckers and divers, you know, and it's waxed and waned on that over the years, but it doesn't seem to be killed off by anything any government throws at it.
It's timeless.
Timeless, yes.
And throughout the lists, the Duke of Westminster remains a name near the top, but a lot of the other names come and go. What kind of pace did you see people enter and exit the rich list?
Once you reached the higher echelons, you might go down for some particular reason, but you rarely left. But as I kept finding more and more people who should have been in the list, and I captured them and put them in, the bottom line kept going up and up and up. So people left not because they were getting poorer, just they didn't make the cut.
That's really interesting. Then looking back in more generally at the rich list, is there anything, how do you feel about it now, your marvellous creation?
Well, I have to say I was always gobsmacked doing it, that I had found something I really enjoyed doing. And I'm gobsmacked that my successor, Rob Watts, seems to enjoy it. And I'm very, very pleased that he's made an even bigger success of it, and he's doing it even better than I could ever hope.